Hello, I'm Toycam, welcome back to our second channel geography video. This is also a series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I wanted to talk about the Arctic Circle because when the Arctic is brought up in TV shows and movies and such, it's usually just referred to very vaguely and generally without a fixed location. It's just like, oh yeah, it's a faraway place with cold stuff and you don't want to go there because it's so far away and cold and it's like the opposite of Antarctica. But the truth is, although it is generally cold in the Arctic and although it is generally quite far north, the Arctic Circle is a precisely defined region and it's not what you might figure. It's not defined by temperature, it's not defined by degrees of latitude or, being the opposite of Antarctica. Instead, the way the Arctic Circle is defined is the point on Earth where you've gone far enough north where you officially have a 24-hour day and a 24-hour night. The sun will rise for 24 hours in a row during the summer and it will set for 24 hours in a row during the winter. Obviously, in most places in the Arctic, it sets for a lot longer and it rises for a lot longer, depending on your season, but that is how you define where the Arctic Circle is, which means it's actually changing every single year. And in case you want to see what it looks like right now, here is the Arctic Circle on a Mercator style map, a flat map, the one you're probably used to. On this map, it's technically actually a rectangle because that's what the map does to the whole globe. So if you actually prefer this map, technically speaking, it's the Arctic rectangle, not the Arctic Circle. However, for today's video, we're going to be using the Arctic Circle just to keep things a bit simpler. So yeah, this is the Arctic Circle. As you can see, it's defined as being a circumference around the North Pole. And yeah, there are 8 countries which have territory inside it right now. There is Russia, there is Norway, there is Finland, Sweden, Iceland, Greenland, which is Denmark, but it's a non-sovereign country within the Kingdom of Denmark. So you can say Denmark or you can say Greenland, whichever one makes you happier. Then we've got Canada. Then we've got Alaska. 8 countries, easy as that, right? And yeah, the interesting thing about this though to me is like, okay, so there's an Arctic Circle and it's defined as being a circle only when you use a globe, which we'll use for the rest of this video. What about the opposite of that? If you go to the opposite side of the globe, is it still the Arctic Circle or is there the Antarctic Circle? Because you might have heard something about the Antarctic Circle, but it's a much less interesting thing to me because again, this is the Arctic Circle. It's like, oh, there's countries, there's cultures, there's peoples. The Antarctic Circle looks like this. It is literally a ring roughly drawn around Antarctica, and yeah, the interesting thing about this is the Antarctic Circle is much colder than the Arctic Circle, generally speaking, which is already very cold, which is why pretty much nothing lives there, especially no people, so there's no cultures, there's no histories, and even today, although some countries are allowed to claim there are very few countries that actively enforce their claims, and there are very few countries who expect to get any use from this in the next 100, 200, whatever years, because Antarctica right now is pretty much unusable. However, the Arctic Circle, which is, again, kind of like the opposite of Antarctica, you don't realize when you look at a flat map, but like the Earth is very top-heavy, which means that a lot of the places you live right now would be very cold on the opposite side of the globe. Interesting kind of fact there, but that means that a lot of the Arctic Circle is habited by countries you know and love, such as Russia, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Greenland, Canada, the USA, etc. Fun fact, I've been to all 8, but let's talk about those 8 countries because they have a lot of interesting things in common. However, I should mention it's really 7 countries we're talking about because the first country I wanted to dive into is Iceland. So Iceland is a country with many famous things about it, although it's not very icy and it's, it's a fun fact about Iceland. But yeah, basically, although Iceland technically has some territory in the Arctic Circle, like all of these other countries where they have a part of it, Iceland has the tiniest part of their territory in the Arctic Circle. Just their furthest north island, it's called Grimsey, is in the Arctic Circle. And just this island right here, Grimsey, is only about half in the Arctic Circle. If you live on the south half of the island, where most of the people do actually live, then you actually have about 23 hours and 58 minutes of day in the summer, and a 23-hour, 58-minute night in the winter, but that's not quite Arctic Circle. Right now, the Arctic Circle is about halfway up the island, and because the Arctic Circle moves every single year, if you're curious as to why that is, by the way, it's not, usually it's like, oh, global warming's coming to get you. In this case, it's not actually to do with global warming, it's just a natural, the Earth tilts very slightly by about a degree change every 20,000 years, and right now it's tilting in a way that moves the Arctic Circle north slightly by a few meters every single year. So by about 2050 or so, in about 30 years, none of Iceland's territory will be covered by the Arctic Circle, which means that there's going to be 7 countries in the Arctic Circle, so we mostly won't talk about Iceland today because, I mean, like, literally, it's like one island. It's an interesting enough island. They have about 80 people living there, and they have a big interest in chess, so at one point, a random American chess grandmaster just decided to fund their island like crazy. Never went there himself. He was just like, let's give them a bunch of money, and in his will, he left even more money for them, so they're all very grateful for that. Also, they recently voted to merge with one of the largest cities in Iceland, which is just the south here. Akureyri, I can't say it correctly, I'm sorry. If you're Icelandic, I love you really. But yeah, basically they decided to merge together, which is an interesting little thing, so that now the territory of Akureyri technically includes this island right here. So yeah, weird facts about Iceland. Again, I could talk about Iceland all day, but today it doesn't really relate to the Arctic Circle, so we won't do it too much. Instead, we'll talk about the fact that the Arctic Circle covers about it's about 1 in 20 of the world's area just alone. So about 5% of the world's surface, it's closer to 4, but 4 to 5% of the world's surface is in the Arctic Circle. This area right here is about 4 to 5% of the world's area, the area we can exist in. It's more than that of the world's land area, because there's a lot of ocean, but it's about that amount of the world's area. But despite that, only 4 million people live there. And that might sound like about right, like, okay, 4%, 4 million people, that sounds about great. But then you consider, oh, there's not 100 million people, there's over 7 billion people on Earth, because that means that in this area, 4% of the world's surface is there. Despite that, only less than 1/10% of the world's population lives there. It's very, very, very population scattered, to say the least. And yeah, this means that every country has one thing in common, and that is very unpopulated norths, because countries that have their territory in the Arctic Circle generally don't have much of their population. They have a lot of territory there, like Canada, huge amount. Denmark, the vast majority of Denmark's land is actually in the Arctic Circle. However, despite that, none of that land, not the vast majority of their population, is not in the Arctic Circle. The vast majority of any of these countries' population is well south of that. And interestingly enough, this means that all of their capital cities, so if you look at Helsinki, Moscow, Stockholm, Oslo, in fact, if we look at the Scandinavian countries, they're all very tall, but all of their capitals are very far south. In fact, Helsinki is the furthest south in Finland almost that you can get, not quite, but almost. And it actually is even though despite that, it's the furthest north city of over 1 million people. So go Helsinki, fun fact for you right there. But then you look at Stockholm, Oslo, Reykjavik, even Greenland, if you consider it to be its own country, even though, again, within the Kingdom of Denmark, their capital is still south of the Arctic Circle, despite most of Greenland's territory being north. Canada's is very far south. Every single one of these, even Alaska's state capital, Anchorage, all of, I think actually, largest city, let's say for now. But basically, there are 8 cities, 8 capitals, etc., and they're all very far south of the Arctic Circle. This is because countries of land north of that, again, most of their people don't live there. Their actual center of, their geographic center might be further north, but their population center, the center of, their whole system, the whole governmental system is all very far south, so just keep that in mind as we go. However, despite the fact that most large cities in most Arctic countries are very far south, again, look at Moscow, St. Petersburg, and etc. in Russia, which is a very far north country. Look at Canada as the best example. All of their cities are pretty much next to the border with the USA. Despite that, there are a couple of cities in the Arctic, or quite a few, they're just not very large, with the exception being Murmansk. So you know how I said roughly 4 million people live north of the Arctic Circle? About 10% of those live in one city in Russia. This one city right here has a huge density of population. It's the big exception to the rule. It gets a lot warmer than the rest of the Arctic Circle in its latitude, and it's one of the furthest north cities of any size you can find. Again, it's a huge industrial Russian city, and if you want to see what it looks like a normal place. You can barely even tell looking at just a random street view, just for an example. You can barely even tell looking at the place. I mean, this is a bad example, right? But you can barely tell looking at most of the place that it is an Arctic city. This just looks like, oh yeah, this is Russia. Like, is this Moscow? Is this another major city? No, this is Murmansk. It's deep into the Arctic Circle. But with this exception, which even then it's not hugely deep into the circle, all of the large cities which are found north of the Arctic are actually, Arctic Circle I should say, are all pretty, small for their size and still pretty far south. Again, bearing in mind that the Arctic Circle does go, that far north, you can see how, like, at the very edge of that is where, like, cities like Murmansk are, like, the northernmost cities in Alaska, etc. Most people who live in the Arctic Circle live just a little north of the border, which is why another major city, Tromsø, again, it's only a little bit north of it. My other favorite example, though, is one you'll find in Russia, because, again, most of the largest cities, which are north of the Arctic Circle, are found in Russia, and one of the biggest examples, in my opinion, is Norilsk. So this is Norilsk right here, or Norilsk. Again, I'm not a Russian pronunciation genius. Hopefully that's not what you came to this video for. If it is, I'm sorry for you. But if you look at this city right here, for instance, 1, there is a Lenin statue, which is a bit of a weird one to find, and 2, this is a very clear example of, like, this is a city in the Arctic that was built to be an Arctic powerhouse. If you look at it, you can see it was literally constructed, and honestly, yeah, as in like, it was very clearly designed, it's got a grid and everything like that, and yeah, this is a good example of like a pre-built city which struggles in the Arctic, whereas Murmansk is one which does surprisingly well, same with Tromsø, etc. So yeah, basically most settlements in the Arctic Circle, very far south, and not very populated in the grand scheme of things, and although a lot of people live in these huge cities, a huge percentage of them do, a lot of people also live in very remote towns, villages, etc. If you look at Resolute, for instance, which is just a random place in Canada, this is one of the places that just blows my mind as like, oh wow, some people live there, it exists. This is the center of civilization on the entire island. It's like a few shacks where you can go and buy something, I guess, and then it's pure wilderness after that. You can literally see the line where it's like, oh, and then it's the wild. And because the villages, the settlements are so small and so far apart, it means there's pretty much no infrastructure this far north. And I mentioned in my video talking about how like, oh yeah, so Canada has bad transport for this reason. It's not just because it's not really feasible to, have a good link to, Resolute on this island right here. It's not just because it's not really feasible in terms of the economics to have a huge highway going from, all the way north in Alaska to all the way south. It's not just for practical reasons they don't do it. It's because, for theoretical reasons, it's also practically very hard to build this far north. The permafrost goes up and down. It makes it hugely difficult to construct anything up here, which is why everything you see this far north looks like kind of a mess. So let's take another example of one of my favorite just questionable cities, which is Barrow, Alaska. It has a second name, which is used in Google Maps in case you're curious. They had a referendum on changing it, and it was that's a whole thing. So they changed their name back to the native people name, so I can't say it, because look at that. Look at this combination of characters together. Can you say UTQIAG-Vik? Utukvik? I don't know. But anyway, that said, so they changed their name recently, but Barrow, Alaska is what you probably know it as if you know your cities in Alaska. And this is a city which, one, blows my mind that it exists. So if we go on to just a random street view of it, it's like, oh, so yeah, look at everything around here. You can see how everything's built differently. Every car is built differently. It's like a different type of car. The way of their life is so hugely different in terms of what they can economically get available to them and how they have to live their lives and what their houses look like. But yet, so much is still the same, despite the fact that it's one of the most northernly, I think it's the most northern settlement in America. Despite that fact, there is still a Japanese restaurant here. I looked into this particular one because I was like, a sucker restaurant? Is that really a Japanese restaurant? Yeah, it's a Japanese restaurant set up by Korean immigrants to America. I don't know why Koreans would immigrate to this far north in Alaska and then set up a Japanese restaurant. I cannot wrap my head around why that's the case or why that's a thing, but it is a thing. There is so many things up here. There's a bank, there is a fur shop, there's a pizza shop, despite it being a really harsh place where if you go outside in the winter at just the wrong time and you forget your keys and you can't go back in your house, you'll freeze to death in the outside. You have minutes to get to the cold. It's deadly. It is not just harsh to survive economically, it's harsh to survive on a physical level, but there's a Mexican grill here. There's a to me, seeing a place like this with 3,000 population, no roads in or out, the only things that get to them, because there's not even really practical ice access, is, planes. Despite that, people kind of thrive and still live like normal there, and I find that to just be hugely fascinating. That despite the Arctic Circle, again, I mentioned it's not based on climate, but generally speaking, it is very cold. Despite that, people manage to make it work, and it's just like another thing where, like, how some people are used to living in places where it's always warm. I think, California's the biggest example of this, where it's warm all year round. It sometimes gets less warm or more warm, but it's always warm there. I live somewhere where there's about 15 degrees of temperature variance between, like, a normal summer day and a normal winter day, and that's really low, apparently, compared to the worldwide average. Some people live in places where you have, like, a huge 100-degree spread. There are places in the Arctic that can be as hot as 30 degrees in the summer, or as cold as minus 50 in the winter. In the same city, the same place, you have to deal with both of those extremes. And that is just a fact of life for some people. A small percentage of the world's population, but it is still a fact of life. And yeah, I just find that pretty interesting. So the other facts we should talk about, while talking about the Arctic, is that the Arctic is a lot colder than it should be. A lot warmer than it should be. The reason so many people live in the Arctic, 4 million, compared to literally you're measuring in the dozens for Antarctica, and even then they don't permanently live there. They live on rotations. No one really wants to live in Antarctica and does for any non-essential reasons, but a lot of people live in the Arctic, and that's where they've made their houses. So how is that the case? And for the longest time, I've never understood how, like, people always say, like, oh, there's the jet stream and there's the oceans and they keep you warm, but actually the Arctic is kept warm by the ocean, and that seems weird, but because there is so much ocean here, that, again, Antarctica is a permanent landmass, there is no permanent landmass at the North Pole. There are stations there are things with flags in and so on and so forth, but there is no permanent ice on the Arctic, which means that there is water there at all times. Water always stays, I think the coldest it gets is like -1, then it starts to freeze, but because there's so much water there, which isn't freezing, that keeps everything around it a lot warmer. It's a really weird effect, which means that effectively a lot of places which should otherwise be entirely freezing manage to survive. That's why a lot of northernmost latitudes in Europe, for instance, are freezing on the other side of, in North America, and I find that kind of fascinating. I also find it fascinating that, again, North America, Europe, Asia all have land north of the Arctic Circle, but only Antarctica has land south of the Antarctic Circle. And also, it's worth noting, the Arctic Circle and the struggle of how cold it is up there is one of the biggest problems with, I guess, Russia. So the reason... again, one of the things that I think confuses people a lot at first is, like, Russia had such a hard struggle to get Crimea. Let's not focus on where it belongs to, but let's just say they really wanted Crimea. Why would they even care so much about having a port here? It doesn't make sense. Russia has so much ocean. Why did they never dominate the oceans? Why did they never have a huge, vast empire which belonged to them because they could colonize the seas? And that's because most of their sea was not usable for most of the year. If it freezes in the winter, your ships can't go anywhere. So Russia mainly has 2 fleets. They have a Pacific fleet, which I think is based at Vladivostok. I'm not innately aware of all the Russian military tactics, but I believe they have a fleet based in the Far East, and they have a fleet based in the Black Sea over here. That's the only places they can actually base ships, because even if you ignore the fact that there's a huge you have to go through so many countries and past Denmark, etc. to get out from here. It freezes over here. It freezes over all the way up here. Most of Russia's sea, even though it has a lot of access, some of the most in the world, freezes over besides in the Black Sea, which again still has the Turkey issues to deal with, and besides in the far, far east, which they, again, in both sides, they put a lot of effort into getting Crimea. That's why there's a you put in getting this area in general. That's why there's the whole Crimean War, not the current one, the over 100 years ago one. And they put a lot of effort into getting Vladivostok during the World Wars. And yeah, the reason for that is because, the navy was becoming more important. And Russia, despite having some of the most sea in the world, could not have a navy because of how, their place is so far north. You don't necessarily anticipate that, but yeah, it freezes up here, which is a problem. And you might not realize that, but that's why Russia's like that. So, more facts about each Arctic country, because I just want to mention that Russia, one of the things they did used to own that they don't anymore, is Russian America or Alaska. So, Alaska is actually a piece of territory that Russia sold to America. If it weren't for Alaska, then there would be obviously no America north of the Arctic Circle. Russia sold a part of their, so if we go back to the map, just for fun, the part of, America, which is north of it, was, sold to them by Russia. So if it weren't for that sale, they wouldn't be north of it. But why did Russia sell Alaska to America? Because so many people mock this on a daily thing, like, oh yeah, we bought it for I think it's $8 million or something, and we're making that investment pay back. But at the time, it was hugely unpopular in America to buy Alaska. It was seen as wasting money, just giving money to Russia. And on the Russian side of things, they didn't want it. They really were sure, because the British were expanding in North America at the time. You can see how much territory they ended up with. But yeah, basically, Russia was sure that eventually Britain would just take their stuff and they wouldn't really be able to defend it too well. So they figured, sell it to America or lose it. It's the same thing with the Louisiana Purchase. One of the hugest purchases in American history. The French sold it because they were sure it would be taken eventually and they needed the money for other things. Same with Russia. Needed money, had territory they thought would be invaded, and that's why these deals make place. It's not that some terrible tactician in Russia was just yeah, what's Russian America good for anyway, right? That's not how these things come about. Geopolitical interests change a lot in 150 years, and that's why I expect the Arctic will change a lot too. One, Greenland is a country which is very likely to eventually go independent. It's currently not sufficient in the slightest, because they have fishing and not too much more as an industry. Most of their money has to come from Denmark. However, despite that, they have a huge nationalist movement, and again, they really don't want to be a part of Denmark, so at some point, it's likely that they'll go independent. Again, who knows what that point is? Maybe the same time that Iceland leaves, so we'll likely see the power balance shift, but again, Greenland will never be a major power, just kind of like a a huge Arctic player, I guess, by itself. And yeah, it's also worth noting that Canada, all of its land that is in the Arctic Circle is owned by Canada as a whole, not by any specific province, and it's also very, very, very unpopulated. Again, there are settlements here, like Resolute, like I mentioned, Polaris, and my favorite one is Alert. This is the northernmost permanently settled place on the Earth, I want to say. But yeah, Alert is just a place where 5 people live for Canadian military purposes. It's one of the craziest, like, this is what it looks like. This is the northernmost settlement. It's a few houses, and I don't even know what that is, covered in snow, and that's it. So, anyway, I could talk about the Arctic all day. I love cold places. I find them fascinating. Like I said, I've actually been to all of the countries in the Arctic Circle, but I've never been north of that circle. Like, I think on flights, I've gone maybe potentially, I'm not even 100% sure, but I've never been to any city north of the Arctic Circle. So at some point, I'm gonna go to, well, I mean, I've been very close, but I'd love to go to Tromsø sometime. I think that's the most accessible Arctic city, so that's a thing. That I think I'd recommend because I've looked into it a whole bunch. Like, it's always been on the list, but there's no flights from London direct to there. You have to go via like Oslo, and I hate connecting flights within Europe because they seem a bit of a... I don't usually do connecting flights unless there's like some fun reason to. So yeah, anyway, that's why Tromsø is like on the list, and like I guess I'll show you when I first go to the Arctic Circle. But before I go though, because I want to talk about the Arctic some more. Like I said, I like cold places, could do it all day, but there's one big question that's been on my mind. So again, generally speaking, this is how I would define my beliefs. I like to look at evidence first and then try and work out the facts from there. A lot of people respond to my Canada transport video by saying, you see, as an ardent communist, this is why all of this is wrong. I'm going to try and justify this really backwardsly of like, oh, really, we should pour more money into it and make it more expensive. And it's like, But yeah, so I'm not that sort of person. So here's a few things in the Arctic I can't quite link together. So every single country which has some for its territory is generally very left-leaning politically. The one exception to this is, of course, Alaska. Alaska is a red state in a very conservative country of the US. However, it's worth noting the Republicans in Alaska aren't the same as the rest of the country. Also worth noting that they had the Alaskan Independence Party at one point, so politics in Alaska is very, very strange. And also worth noting that Alaska is one of the few places in the world which has a UBI, a Universal Basic Income. And it's not phrased as a UBI. It's not like, this is so you don't have to work, like in a lot of countries it is. It's just, yeah, you live in Alaska and it's hard here, so have a bunch of money on us. I think it's paid for by oil, maybe. It's just one of those fascinating things that, like, all of these countries are quite left-leaning. Alaska's a maybe exception, but it's still not really. Russia, a few people say it's an exception, but I mean, they literally had the Soviet Revolution, one of the very few countries on Earth. And even today, where Putin's in charge, and you can argue he's not left, it's like the second largest party in Russia is the Communist Party. If Putin falls, the Communists are taking over again, So, there's like, every country is very left-leaning, politically speaking. They're also very well off economically, with Russia being the huge exception, although even then on a global scale, Russia does quite well. All of the countries, even the ones without oil, because Norway has a bunch of oil, of course, yeah, right, that's the easy thing. But like, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, Canada, and America, all very, very high income countries, with the Nordics being particularly high. And then the other thing is the fact that all of these countries have very, very poorly developed norths and a lot more territory than most countries. So the first largest country is north of the Arctic Circle. The second largest country, also north. The third largest country, also north, depending on how you want to measure that. China's not, but it's the biggest exception in the top 4. They're all very large countries. My theory on that one alone would be like, okay, they can easily get their borders, because if you claim land in the Arctic that no one's claimed before, no one's going to go there and refute you because it's so cold and no one wants to generally go there to collect it. So Sweden, Norway, and Finland, much bigger than most Central European countries. Russia, biggest country. I mean, what more do I need to say about Greenland, Canada, and America? So yeah, lots of land, lots of money, left-leaning politically. I don't think necessarily, a lot of people will be like, left-leaning means make money, right? But they're left-leaning in like the business-friendly way. So it's not like your traditional Venezuelan dream or whatever, your actual dream is. So there's this whole thing of like, how do those things link together? I don't know for sure. I would love to know your conclusions. Again, please don't do this thing where you're like, here's my political beliefs, let me wrap my facts around this, because I see so much of that. Let me know if you have a good theory about that, because it's one of those things that I think about a lot, like trying to work it out, and I don't think I have an answer for you, because there are parts of the world where they have a lot of the same features, but they're not in the Arctic. Again, if you're left-leaning politically in another part of the world and you're not in the Arctic Circle, there's a lot of countries doing horrifically from that. A lot of countries which have a lot of land area in other parts of the world. I mean, look at Algeria or the DRC or whatever. Not great doing, because it's the similar thing. So yeah, what do you think the logic is? Let me know. Comments down below. But for now, second channel. Don't care. Goodbye.